Shirley Adams with the Sewing Connection, Series 14, Program 6. I would guess if you'd sort out the leftovers of garments past, there'd be some marvelous mergers in your stash just waiting to become reality. To shake up your thought processes and let you imagine some beauties of your own, let me give you some ideas. This whole thing started as I had finished this shell that I have on the mannequin right now. It's crepe back satin. Actually, it's reversible. You can wear it either way. And as I was putting away the scraps from this, and there wasn't much, but it was enough to save. It was, maybe an 18-inch square is all I had left of that. But I thought, well, it'll come in useful for something. Now, I've told you on previous programs how I sort my stash. I have all my fabrics stored according to color because it's the easiest way to find them when I'm looking for little bits and pieces of this and that. And so as I was putting this away on that same shelf, I had some other very dull blue, green, gray fabrics, and I noticed, doesn't that go well with this wrinkled fabric, a little bit of shibori that we'll have in a program several weeks down the line. And I had some scraps of this. And then I also had some scraps of this left over from a program we did a couple of weeks ago. And the lining from something else. Well, all those things just look pretty good together since they're all the same colors, but none of them were big enough to really make anything out of. But it kind of said, how about putting those together? Now, one of the reasons I did this is because I've seen in the past year so many quilters and so many wearable artists, and they don't dwell on that 2 or 3 or whatever yard piece that most sewers do. They think it's just fine if you have a little bit of this and that and put it all together and see what comes of it. So this is what I decided to do. But first of all, it's a pattern. What are you going to make in it? Well, I didn't have very much really, so obviously a vest was a good thing to do. And I've started my usual way, just with a basic, and then what I've done to that basic is add something. And the reason I added this little thing over here, this wing up the front, the reason I added that is because I have 3 buttons, all alike, but different sizes. So I needed something big here to put the 2 big buttons on, and then because this one down here is smaller, I thought, well, I better put it away from the big one since it isn't the same size. So that really is the only reason for this thing coming out here. You design whatever seems applicable to what it is you're using. And of course, while I was adding this wing, I also put an extension on for a seam allowance and for an overlap for buttons, buttonholes, whatever. Because it's going to be a vest, you usually cut it down a little lower under the arm so that other garments can go under it so that it all works comfortably. And it's that easy to change that pattern a little bit. Well, also because I didn't have a whole lot of fabric and because there was no reason for it, I only have a wing on this one side. Underneath I don't. It doesn't come over here. The underneath side just comes straight down. So here's the facing pattern I had for that, and at the same time I was doing that, I simply cut off this extra since I had no use for this little extra wing that was here, and that's how the second side looks. So you design whatever you want. It's amazing how the more you design, the more casual you can become about this because it is all so easy. Well, then I decided that all these little bits and pieces of fabric need to be mounted on something. And sometimes the easiest thing to do is just mount them on a piece of fusible right off the bat, some fusible interfacing, and then when you get everything put in place, you can just press it and it's all going to stick together. So kind of a good idea, so I thought. And I was going to start out, I had actually 4 pieces of this, and they're a little bit different color. This one has a little green look to it, and this one has a little blue look to it. And I was trying to decide whether to do a green and a blue and a green on the back or how to mix them up. But anyway, what I was going to do is stretch them out a little bit and fuse them and use this as the beginning of a log cabin, really. I was going to put another piece of fabric then on each of the corners going around this diamond and covering it up, but I really didn't have enough fabric to do it that way. I was going to have to do too big a mixture. So it hit me that the easiest thing to do is to first of all stretch this out, not completely because I don't want it, its biggest, I don't want it completely flat. I wanted a little texture in it. But I stretched it out considerably, and I fused it to a backing first. And then that backing that I fused it to permitted me, since it had everything stable, here's what the original backing was that I had it fused to, again, some fusible tricot. And then it was easy to cut it up because it was stable. It no longer would stretch and move the way it does before it's fused. So after it was all fused, then it was easy to cut up. Well, here I have just a scrap of some other fabric. I might want this, so I'm not going to cut it up. I might want it for something else down the line. So I have some other scraps here that are already fused to a backing. There's something you saw, about 2 or 3 series ago, proudly. These are the scraps left over. And so this is the idea. I just decided what would be the good shapes. Now, when you're cutting out shapes, think about how it's going to look on your body. And more than likely, you don't want to make a barrel-shaped thing, or you don't want to make a pear-shaped thing. Usually you want to kind of broaden the shoulder area because it makes the rest of you look slimmer. So I was trying to get something like that going. Therefore, to broaden the shoulders, I would put a piece maybe up here and cut it out. And it's simply a matter of cutting off what you don't want. And then I'd put something else on. Well, it became rather obvious after a while that the easiest way to do this would be if I wouldn't do this on the flat, but instead do it in the round, do it on a body. I don't have an extra body around my sewing room that I can do this on. So here the simple way was either to put it on a mannequin, which is a possibility, or maybe on this one up here, this wire one, but really the easiest way, and something that everybody has, and probably you have them in several sizes, are these cutting boards. They're great, these rotary cutting boards. If you're small, this might be the good size. If you're kind of a middle size, this might be good. And rather than stitch these together, these pieces, and have to press open seams, what I did is just sort of overlap where the seams were going to be, the back and front and around the sides, and then use this just propped up against a piece of furniture to do everything on, because what I was doing is not stopping right at the seam allowance. It goes right over the seam and onto the back here. And the same thing around the side. It goes beyond the side and just wraps around, because this was going to be the best use of my scraps. So this is why I built it in the round and built it over a cutting board. But just for now, for our purposes, I'm going to do this in the flat just because it's easier, since I don't have a piece of furniture here to lean this up against. This will be easier, so I'm just going to put a few of these pieces on. And where you put them is up to you, doesn't matter. You just play around with them until you decide that, yeah, that's a design I can live with, that I like. And so just break it up however you want to. Now eventually we're going to, and I'm going to do this of course very quickly and just overlap them, because we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, because it's never anything that's going to be used. It is merely unusable scraps. So I might have done something like this, and then maybe I'd put a little something else on it, and I'm not going to put this on it because this is a fabric that melts if you press it. So it isn't really one that I want to press at all. I'll just put another piece of something else on it, a little bit more of this, and then I would build maybe another piece on back here. However, no, I better put a piece of this on, so I have a little assortment here. So this might go here, and then something else to look a little more artistic might go down the center of it, but hopefully you get the idea. Be a little more artistic than I am being right now, because this isn't really very wonderful. Okay, well anyway, after you get this all positioned the way you think that, yes, that I can live with. Here, I'll put this down here. I was just trying to break up that big blue piece in some way. After you get something that you like, which I don't like this, but just to not fool around with this forever, I'm pretending I do like it. So once you get it all in place the way you're going to leave it, then go ahead and pin it. And that's also nice about having this cutting mat down here, the fact that you can just pin right over it and you're not going to ruin anything, because of course it's impervious to cutting. It's not going to be damaged by your pins. And so once we put a bunch of pins down here to hold it in place temporarily, then we can take it back to the ironing board and just do a little pressing. And then after that, we're going to have to take it to the sewing machine and do a little sewing on it. So it's just enough to hold it, because of course on the ironing board I'll have to pull the pins out anyway. So this ought to do the job. I better take my pins with me. And we'll just move this back to the ironing board and give it a little fuse. And I don't know how I could survive without the fusibles. I was so glad when they came on the market. They really enable us to do things we couldn't do before they were available. And there we go. So we'll just get a little steam into this, and it's going to get a little warm and steamy. I'll turn on the exhaust and get rid of that heat and steam. Now, of course, I have raw edges every place, and I don't want these raw edges to be here because they will ravel and they aren't too pretty anyway. So you have to decide on something to do to get rid of the raw edges. And that's something I'm going to do, is just tuck them under and sew them. Now there are some other variables here. You could cover those with bias tape or with whatever you have that might cover them up and make them look a little bit more finished. But I'm going to instead just fold them under and finish them off that way. I have a contrasting thread here just so that you can see what it looks like more easily. You, of course, would use a matching thread to make it look really nice. But wherever it's loose here, it'll fold under. So it's just a matter then of turning this under and doing a little stitching to finish it off. And not only do I want to stitch it, but also this is perhaps kind of a nice way to anchor it more completely, because even though you fuse it, if this gets a lot of hardware or if it gets goes to the cleaners, because of the mixture of fabrics, it wouldn't be washed. It would go to the cleaners probably, even if it's all washable fabrics. But you can see how this would be very easy to just turn under these edges and put a few pins to hold until you can get the job done, until you come up to the pins, and then take them out as you go. And so once we have some of these done, then it would be a little sewing. And this, of course, is going to be just straight stitch, so it's very simple to do. And the fact that you would be using the same color thread, it would blend in and it wouldn't even be noticeable. So it's just sort of edge stitching this and getting as close to it as you can so that nothing shows. Now the fact that this was wrinkled fabric, what's nice about that is that those threads just sort of bury down into it, or burrow down into it, and they really don't show. And if I put this on the needle down position, then it's going to be easier every time I stop to take out a pin and to maybe lift up the presser foot slightly with my knee, because I'm using the knee lift here just to make it easy. And then you can tuck under a little bit at a time and go ahead and do that stitching. Here's a place where you could also maybe couch yarn, just zigzag yarn on it, anything to cover up that joining so that it does look nice all the time. And anyway, do that all over the whole thing. Now I was putting this on flannel because after I had it all fused, I also put it on flannel. And this is what I actually did the stitching for in order to quilt it to the flannel. I had another layer under here, just outing flannel, just flannel that you'd get inexpensively in a fabric department. And with that under it, I did the stitching, and it kind of quilted it, so it held it all together very nicely. Now where it did not quilt was wherever I had these plain spaces, this crepe back satin, the satin parts here. It was not quilted there. There was no way to stitch it down because that's such smooth, shiny fabric that if you have just a little hint of a hand stitch or anything, it is going to show. So in order to get that all mounted and all together nicely, and also to cover a few awkward places that I needed to have covered, I had some of this fabric a couple of shows ago, and this is that kind that really doesn't want to press at all, but it does tubes very nicely. And I even had some leftover tubes that I had been pin weaving. So those tubes, which won't press flat, you can press forever, you can melt it, but can't flatten it. So those tubes just seem to be very nice. And of course these are cut on the bias. So bias means you can go around curves, the same as if you do have bias pressed flat. It goes around curves and covers things up beautifully. Because it's on the bias, it stretches and contracts and does things that are very nice without making wrinkles. So this was just putting tubes wherever they needed to be, maybe to complete the design, maybe to cover up something that wasn't supposed to be there. What I love to do about putting scraps together like this is it gives you such a sense of accomplishment when you don't have a cent in it. You're just playing with things that you don't care about anyway, and you tend to be more creative that way because you aren't concerned about it. You aren't uptight about it, and you do things that are a little perhaps out of the ordinary for you. So that makes it a lot of fun. Once we have this all quilted then to the backing, we're also going to want to do something about finishing the whole thing. Now remember I said I was doing this in the round. Therefore, I would already have the seams in every place. I wouldn't have to do anything about that. All I had to do is do something about finishing the edge, and that something was a piping around here that goes between the lining fabric and the outer fabric, just because piping gives such a nice finish. Well, if you haven't made piping, here's how. It's simply a bias strip of fabric, and once you've cut the bias, you probably want to welt it in some way, make it a little fat there, give it a little body and a little substance by putting some yarn in it. If this is going to be washable, don't put a wool yarn in it because you don't want to worry about the shrinkage. But what I really need here is a piping foot. And if you don't have one, go to your dealer. Whatever brand of machine you have, they all have surely a piping foot. And that piping foot is just great because things run right along in that little channel and do such a nice job. So once I have this piping foot in place, I'll put the thread through the hole here and we'll just make a little of that piping. Now what I didn't show you, did I? What this has though is a little channel underneath. And I'll just turn this around so you can see it. There's a little channel underneath there on both the right and the left side. And that's where the yarn is going to track as I do this. And because whatever you're putting in there for a filling, the yarn in this case, it just stays right in that little groove so nicely. And you can't go wrong. It's going to be a perfectly straight line that you stitch because the yarn will hold it in place here. So if you don't have one of these feet, you really need to go get one. And you can do a job much better than you could without it. Now there's also the possibility of using a zipper foot here, but it isn't going to do the job as well probably as a piping foot does. So it just gives a really nice even line along there, holds it all together, and then that piping is going to be stitched as the two are put together. Well, this was kind of fun, and I'm not finished. I might get back to it yet, but in the meantime, there are some things I really want to show you because I had fun with this. You won't believe what fun some other people had with theirs. The first thing I want to show you on a model is this really wonderful jacket by Alice Cool. And I met her up in Victoria, British Columbia, where she was wearing this. And it's really kind of a Koos Vandenakker type piecing because there she does have bias covering all the extra pieces. Now this jacket is basically linen, but it has about 3 or 4 other fabrics on it, and she's created this wonderful design and then covered all the edges beautifully. She really has lovely workmanship. I've forgotten what her real job, her day job is, but it's something that, like mathematical or whatever, but yes, it runs in line that she would do such a good job on this. Well, it was so good that with all the lace and everything else she's put on it, it won first prize, and it won her a trip down to Texas, of all places, as she entered this in a contest, and BC Woman, a magazine up there, had the contest. So congratulations to Alice. The next outfit here is just really fun. Now this is Ann Fortin from Lindale, Texas, and just look at all the scraps she has used on that. There must be at least 30 little bitty pieces down that front. Now basically it's a striped silk, but that whole front panel is, a combination of everything imaginable. It's silk and rayon and a little suede, and lots of stitching, lots of beading, lots of yarns on it. There is everything you can imagine on that front, and I imagine a whole lot of it's handwork and took quite a long time. But did she stop with that? No, she did not. She made this cape to go over it. And notice as the model holds out her arms that this is actually a rectangle of fabric. So isn't that easy? And then you just fasten it a little bit under the arms. And it's a really pretty aqua mohair that she's made it out of. And of course a jaunty little hat tops it all with, again, a big combination of fabrics. But flip that cape open and let's look at the lining. Now here's also where you might use some marvelous little bits and pieces of this and that. Whatever looks pretty on it, whatever kind of goes color-wise. And this looks like part of a scarf. Looks like maybe it used to be over a piano, who knows where. But anyway, it's a really fun thing that Ann has done on this. Now I have it firsthand that in a former life, Ann used to be a princess just straight out of the Arabian Nights. And doesn't this outfit look the part? Another one here that is just really neat. This is a wearable artist. This is Joy Bush from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And if you think that all wearable art is really colorful and so on, you can see that it can be quite subdued too. This one is a cascade of leaves. Autumn Leaves, I believe, is the name of it, is what she calls it. And it's a lot of different wools all put together, but quite nicely, beautifully done actually. But it's all these leaves in wool and then some beading and lots of stitching on it. And again, just a wonderful use of scraps. Now, who knows if any of these things were purchased especially for this garment, or if they all were just born of scraps in the stash, who knows. This one was definitely a scrap, and this is Jeanette Boussard of Elgin, Illinois, and she had made from that Indian blanket a coat for her mother, and then she had some scraps left over. And because the colors of this Indian blanket were in the olives and the dull reds and black, she took some, kind of army green, denim is what it is, that she mixed with it to make the body of the jacket and also the matching skirt, and parts of the vest that go with it. They are out of that olive. And then just a few other fabrics mixed in with it to make it look really smashing, and maybe to supplement so that she'd have enough fabric to go over the whole thing. A few little dangly beads completed here and there. It looks like a cityscape down there at the bottom, doesn't it? The way the Indian blanket is cut around, so it almost looks like city buildings. But just very pretty, very nicely done, and I'm sure a great source of satisfaction that she put together so much fun out of so little. Well, the next outfit we have there is equally wonderful. And what this is from June Grieg in St. Louis, Missouri. And what's kind of fun about this, you have to really come in close to see this, but what's fun about it is not only is it all these wool scraps, and they were not covered over like Alice's were with bias tape. Instead, June actually did seams all over this. And after she had it all seamed, she completely covered all those seams. I wonder how many movies she watched as she was sewing that on, because she completely covered all those seam joinings with hooks and eyes and snaps. Hundreds of them, I would guess, because they completely cover every fabric joining. So it's just a fun thing. If you have a big collection of them, you know exactly where to put them next time. And then also by June Grieg, she's been very busy. Now, she has recently retired, and she has for years and years worked in one of the foremost retail establishments in the nation, which you see in many places. One of my favorite places as I travel to go look for good ideas. And one day as she was in the men's department, they said, "June, we know you sew. Would you like to have all those cutoffs at the bottom of men's pants when they hem them, and all those pieces, however long, are left behind?" And she said, "Sure, I'd like to have those." So look what June has done with these. We need 3 models or so to show all this, but she has used all those cutoffs and done some piecing with it. Isn't that coat wonderful? With that coat, she has made all these triangles and put them together, and notice how artfully it's done. There are larger triangles at the bottom, smaller at the top, because the coat gets smaller at the top. And notice that, and the other jacket, a suit jacket, with, everything from flying geese to tumbling blocks to whatever kind of piecing is on it. Notice how they then go with all 4 of the bottom parts. There is a pair of shorts, and some slacks, and a skirt, and a long skirt, and any of those can go with either coat because they all use the very same cutoffs from these men's pants. And look at the one model who even has the shoulder bag, which is a combination of those scraps and a little leather. Isn't this terrific? Don't you just love the wonderfully innovative things that people all over do? Great ideas. Now, what's good about recycling or using up these scraps is that it gives you permission to go out and buy something new because you have recycled. And so what I bought that was new was this velour that I have the pant outfit out of. And my first thought, of course, when I get home is, what am I going to do with this pile fabric as far as direction goes, and what am I going to do about seaming it? So the first thing was putting the length of it around my neck. I wanted to make sure that I had both the up and the down direction next to each other so that the pile goes both ways. I could then see the color difference and decide by looking in the mirror with this around my neck which one I wanted to use, and therefore cut the whole pattern that way. Also, the seams. I tried everything imaginable. I tried serging them together and pressing it one way, or serging it and top stitching it, or serging it separately and pressing it open, or maybe not serging it and pressing it to one side. What I actually did is absolutely nothing. I just stitched a straight seam. It automatically just opened itself up, and it needed really no pressing. It's just sort of rubbing it, patting it flat, and that's all it has to have done to it, and it comes out looking just great. The more I worked with it doing other things, the worse it looked. So treat things simply. You don't always have to start the hard way. Well, do I have you thinking? Maybe it's using those scraps to create a new outfit, or maybe you'll start with something old and add a new look to it. Whichever, dig around in your space and find something terrific. That space will be so much better if you can just get it organized in a really workable manner. Join me next time and we'll find some solutions for organizing your space.